Good morning. I'm very pleased to moderate this roundtable dedicated to a very important and current topic: transitioning infrastructure from brown to green, addressing mitigation and adaptation. I'm Jean BENSAID, head of Infra, which is the advisory department for infrastructure financing within the French Treasury. And to discuss this very important topic, we have today 4 speakers representing major players of the infrastructure financing ecosystem. First, Bérénice ARBONA, who is head of infrastructure debt at LBP Asset Management. Then Guillaume CAMUS, head of equity investment activities in France at IFM Investors. Antoine BOUZANQUET, partner at the energy and infrastructure practice of Willkie, Farr and Gallagher. And finally, Laurent, CHATELIN, who is the co-founder of the Sustainable Infrastructure Equity Investment Practice at Eurazeo in Paris. To introduce this discussion, I would say, of course, that the impact of the climate change are becoming increasingly evident with the frequency and severity of extreme events such as floods, heat waves, wildfires surpassing historic norms. I would like to take this opportunity to express our solidarity with our Spanish colleagues in this difficult moment for them. But as a consequence of this situation, the global shift to reach the Paris objectives requires a fundamental change and rethinking of how we build and manage infrastructures, especially calling for transitioning from brown infrastructures, meaning carbon-intensive systems, to green infrastructures, meaning sustainable, resilient, and low-emission systems. Another way to say it is that we are now engaged in a twin movement regarding our infrastructure assets, mitigation as well as adaptation. This means a big transition from brown to green, be it decarbonizing existing infrastructure or creating new green assets. To begin this discussion, I would like to ask to Antoine, from your legal standpoint, how would you describe the current landscape in Europe now that the European Green Deal is in the implementation phase? Would you say that the current regulatory framework is effectively driving the transition from brown to green, combining mitigation and adaptation?
Good morning, everyone. Yes, I think you're right. We are at the end of a cycle. It's been a very intense period in terms of new regulations in Europe during the past 5 years. And I think much has been said during the previous Infra weeks about the Fit for 55 plan, the REPowerEU plan, and all their initiatives as part of the European Green Deal. It's been a systemic change of that regulatory framework. I think now we can take a step back, and there are criticisms. I'll come back to these criticisms about these new regulations. But if you think about it, 5 years ago, people were asking for more visibility because we only had very abstract targets for the end of the century with the Paris agreements. And we had the carbon neutrality target in 2050, but nothing in between. And we needed more visibility, forward-looking policies for that duration between now and 2050. And I think we now have them with the European Green Deal. And Europe has laid the foundations of the decarbonized world of tomorrow. Things will need to be adapted, slightly adjusted to make sure it's aligned with market realities. But Europe has sent a very strong signal 5 years ago and during that 5-year period. And that strong signal has been heard by entrepreneurs, who have started new ventures in the energy transition sector has been held by infra funds who have raised large amounts of money, and debt providers, of course, who have reallocated their resources to these projects. And as a matter of fact, if you look at, if you read the Draghi report, and the same figures are in the latest report of the International Energy Agency, the Energy Outlook, Europe has invested last year 400 billion, which is more than the US in the clean investments. I think we don't hear that very often. And of course, I'm not denying the difficulties of Europe, but and the US has invested a lot in other sectors, digital infrastructure, in their domestic oil and gas market, of course. But in terms of clean investments, we are ahead. So I think it's unfair to say that regulations have prevented investments during the past years in Europe. It's not true. And maybe to demonstrate the importance of having a stable and comprehensive regulatory framework, I could take the example of EV charging. I mean, who would have invested in EV charging infrastructure without the ICE ban in 2035, or without the CAFE regulation, which strikes right now, or without, in France, the LOM legislation, which has released a considerable amount of land for that purpose. Same thing for the gigafactories of batteries. I mean, I know there are industrial difficulties, there are delays, it's a complex issue. We are building a new industry from scratch. But the amount of investments during the past 5 years has been considerable if you consider where we were 5 years ago without any kind of battery industry in Europe. And by the way, I think we can say here that the public sector has played his role because it's 3 billion euros which have been invested in France. I'm taking the example of France with Vercors, with ACC, Prologium, 3 billion euros. So I think now the criticism, people say that there are too many regulations, we have regulated too much, it's too complex. It is complex, but the underlying issues, the technical issues are very complex themselves. We are talking about a systemic change now. It's the investments of a generation, and there is no point in investing for the next 30 years, 20 years, if we are not sure that we are building green or decarbonized assets, right? And what's the purpose of the regulation is defining exactly what is green, and it's complex to define what is green. And if I take, and I think that will be a general alignment in developed countries of the regulatory framework. If you take the parallel with the US, people say that we have regulated too much, but in the US they only play the carrot side with the Inflation Reduction Act. In fact, I had that discussion last year with a lobbyist in the hydrogen sector in France. He was saying that the European framework on hydrogen is awful, it's too complex, it's too stringent. While in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, they will play it better than us and they will have a more mature industry quicker than us. But 6 months later, a few months earlier, the IRS, which is the tax administration in the US, they have implemented the guidelines, to obtain the tax credit, the investment tax credit. And it is very complex. They actually copy-pasted the delegated acts that we have in Europe on green hydrogen. So again, I think it's not true to say that regulations prevent investments. I think it allows, in a certain manner, the investments. We will need to come back to some of that regulation which is not aligned to market realities. But I think first we need to keep some form of stability and make sure that what has based long-term investment decisions remain. We need to somehow protect the frontrunners who have taken the risk because they will not do it twice. I think we need to keep that collective conviction that in the future green assets will be more competitive in the long run than brown assets in that transition from brown to green. And yes, I think we need also to make sure that the demand is not lagging behind. That's what we observe in certain sectors, like, I was talking about EV charging, but same thing for hydrogen. And I was very pleased to see that the last pieces of regulation as part of the European Green Deal was the reform of the carbon markets and prices, which will increase over time. And of course, the other missing chunk, which was the CBAM, which is as part of the industrial policy, making sure that we have a level playing field. And so I think that I'm confident that new regulation will drive supply and demand in the right direction, and we need to reallocate probably the public support to make sure that people get on board of that transition.
Thank you very much, Antoine, for this positive and optimistic message concerning the European landscape. Bérénice, do you share these views? And how do you address this question of mitigation and also the financing of brown to green assets?
Thank you. To address this question, we have developed at LBPAM a two-step approach involving the design of innovative investment strategy, focus both on CO2 emission reduction, but also on the transition from brown to green assets. First of all, we have tried to work on mitigation only. Thanks to all the work we have performed to assess the carbon footprint of a diversified portfolio of infrastructure investment, we have decided in 2022 to launch the most stringent investment strategy, which is Article 9 Impact Fund, specifically designed to tackle climate change mitigations. So all the investment of these funds needs to be in line with the intentionality of the fund, which is to reduce carbon emissions towards the Paris Agreement. So this is a very clear goal, and this is a very pure investment strategy. One of the difficulties was to know how to be sure that all the investment will meet the reduction target. And we have been able to leverage on regulations, and we have been able to leverage on all the work that has been performed by the European Commission in order to define the European taxonomy. Objective number one of the European taxonomy is precisely about climate change mitigations. Within this regulation, we have a clear definition to define what is a green infrastructure that will be able to meet climate change climate change mitigation or not. What is very interesting, however, in this fund is that climate change mitigation is not only renewable energy, it's much more than that. And within the infrastructure spectrum, there are a lot of sectors at play. It's also about energy efficiency of the building, it's about smart meters, it's about green mobility, and there are numerous sectors at stake. We have then decided to also go a step further by designing the year after an investment strategy that will also include transitioning brown to green assets. But it is true that European taxonomy is very clear, but one of the drawbacks of the European taxonomy is that unfortunately the world is not black and white. I used to say that, there are 50 shades of grey infrastructure that are also very relevant to curb carbon emissions. And to finance also brown to green infrastructure, what we have decided is to put in place an Article 8 impact strategy. And to include also those brown to green assets, we are leveraging on innovative financing tools, such as sustainability-linked KPIs, that enable us to be sure that those brown assets will meet their trajectory by implementing within the financial documentations KPIs that enable us to be sure that sponsor will do their job and will try to, do some effective work to go toward more green infrastructure.
Thank you, Bérénice. Turning to the equity investors, Guillaume, as a fund manager, how do you incorporate adaptation and mitigation in your investment strategy?
Good morning, everyone. So I think the starting point is we have a very long-term investment horizon. Our strategies are typically open-ended, and so sustainability, adaptation, and mitigations are a key part of the strategies. We also operate Article 8 and 9 funds. The other way around, we started with Article 8 and then we moved to Article 9, but ultimately there's the same focus on sustainability. I think a good example is when we approach our investment committee, we typically present first a decarbonization strategy for any asset, a trajectory, which is the mitigation component. We do extensive work on the physical risk, so on the adaptation side. And then we also bring it together with an assessment of transition risks, which is basically the business model and how different climate policies can impact our business models. I think if we zoom first on mitigation, and maybe I'll let Laurent speak a bit about that from an Article 9 perspective and then come back to it.
Laurent?
Sure. Thank you, Guillaume. Thank you for having me at this roundtable this morning. We, as Jean was saying, we founded with my partners this investment strategy 4 years ago around sustainability and decarbonization. And I'm very pleased to see 4 years down the road that what we talk about this morning is all about decarbonization. And decarbonization is really the key factor to mitigate climate change. It has been shown that the rise of anthropogenic carbon in the atmosphere has a direct influence on the climate. We've seen recent events in Spain as one example, and this is just the start. Strong climate events are ahead of us, and we need to not only mitigate, which is reduce our carbon footprint, but also adapt to this changing climate. So 4 years down the road, we are now managing a fund, an Article 9 fund. So Article 9 is a specific type of fund where you have a framework that engage you in making sustainable investments. And those sustainable investments are measured against the ability to either bring brown to green, so to lower the carbon footprint of your assets, or to invest into directly green assets. I think Thierry was saying everybody knows about green electricity. How do you produce green electricity from solar, from wind, from hydro? But now today what we see is it's much beyond that. Electrification of transport is a case in point. 25% of the carbon footprint of Europe is about transport. So decarbonizing transport is very key, and we've made an investment into an EV charging operator. So coming back to the question about adaptation, adaptation is something which is is in our DNA. We genuinely look at investing into assets that will be sustainable and therefore that will adapt to the climate change, but also that will sustain the change in business model. And precisely how do we do that? Each time we look at an investment, we put together a financial model, financial business plan, but at the same time we also do a carbon business plan. So we do a carbon business plan in order to plot a trajectory for those assets that we bring from brown to green that is in line with Paris Agreement. And we make investments in order to have this trajectory over time. And as we are equity investors, we also have the governance to implement this decarbonization. And I think that's where we really have a key role to play in decarbonization as equity investors, and where it is also our fiduciary duty to do so decarbonization is through the governance we exercise on those assets so that we can ensure that effectively we'll bring them to a low carbon environment. And just to conclude, before we come to adaptation, we are also strong believers that sustainability and decarbonization is creating value, will create value as they will create sustainable assets over the long run, but also interesting investment opportunity for the next buyer. So never forget, we are owners of those assets for a short period of time. We're looking at 20, 30 years assets. We hold them for 5, 7, 9 years. There will be another owner. And at the end of the day, we also are here to create value for investors. And we believe it is a great way to create value over time for investors. But what about...
I mean, maybe just to pick up on a bit on mitigation, and then I'll speak more about adaptation as well. So on mitigation, we have similar approach to what Laurent described, but we manage today about close to 70 billion euro of infrastructure assets globally. So there's a very significant impact on decarbonization and mitigation we can have on these existing assets. Can take a lot of different shapes in terms of initiatives, from on-site renewable generation to energy savings to changing the way we operate certain of these assets. And one example of the tools we use to do that is what we call the marginal abatement cost curve, which is effectively ranking all these initiatives to reduce carbon emissions and taking a look at the impact they can have in terms of volume and cost in order to prioritize them and have a clear strategy in terms of mitigation. So I think that's for the mitigation point I just wanted to cover. Now, if we talk a bit about adaptation, which again is very important when you manage a large portfolio of assets for the long term, I think the starting point is really the risk assessment and understanding the physical risks associated with your assets. Just to give an example, for example, if we look at any port investments, we will look at scenarios of sea rising levels and probabilities of flooding of the assets. We work with specialized advisors for that, and then we assess the resilience and the investment needs for that port. I think once the risk assessment is done, then it feeds into actions, and I'll touch on two types of actions with some examples as well. The first type of action is asset-light operational initiatives, which are often less costly and easier to implement. For example, for one of our companies, an electricity network, we perform aerial scan of the network to look for vegetation close to the network, and we do that ahead of storm or fire seasons. And by removing this vegetation, you can actually significantly reduce the physical risk, and it's an example of low-cost adaptation, if I can call it like that. So that's on the asset side. Also for a road company we operate, then to address the risk of flooding, they used to do annual inspections of the network, look to remove debris, and essentially by doing that you reduce the risk of flooding. And by moving to a quarterly approach instead of a yearly approach, you actually significantly reduce the risk of flooding, and that's there are easy things to implement like that to reduce the adaptation risk. So that's on the asset light side. Now, of course, the sort of asset heavy investments are also important for adaptation. And again, to give some example, I think there's two types of investments in a way. Some of them are regulated, and it's clearly defined what adaptation investment should look like. If you take regulated assets, again, such as electricity networks, very often it's part of the regular dialogue there will be with the regulator. For example, when you choose to deploy more underground cables as opposed to overhead cables, that's defined, that goes into your regulated asset base, you're remunerated for that, and effectively you're reducing your physical risk associated with storms, for example. So for some assets it's regulated, for others it's not, and it's just part of, I would say, a could design in terms of your CapEx program. And essentially, well, one example could be for wind and solar assets. You're looking at deeper foundations, for example, for some of these assets to be more resilient. So hopefully between the answer of Laurent and this gives you the full picture of mitigation and adaptation.
Thank you very much for this answer, and you have touched to the question 2 already. So I would like maybe to be more specific with you on the impact of this question of adaptation on the risk-return profile of your investments. How do you integrate the need for adaptation? Is there an extra risk premium in the investments? Do you ask for a higher return because of this new adaptation objective? And do you think that, in fact, investment in adaptation are high enough to meet the objectives? According to a recent report made by the OECD, it seems that financial flows are predominantly directed towards mitigation and not enough for adaptation. Do you share this view? And how in your practice do you integrate these twin objectives of mitigation and adaptation, especially on the risk-return profile of your investments? Maybe, I don't know, Laurent or Guillaume, begin and then...
Sure. Adaptation per se is not an easy investment case, because first and foremost, what we look to do is to have a kind of financial return on the investment we do. So the question that begs adaptation is who will pay for this adaptation? Who is the beneficiary of this adaptation? And the answer is not easy. There could be some situation where, for example, you could imagine a PPP framework where effectively public entities will pay for over time for you to make an investment in the form of lease payments. When it comes to mitigation, we look also at adaptation when we think mitigation. And the word I like is resilience. Resilience is a form of adaptation over time. So it's a dynamic view of adaptation. If your infrastructure is adapted over time, then it becomes resilient. So that's the way we look at it. So we do it at entry. We assess through due diligence climate risk, but also business risk when it comes to the infrastructure and its exposure to those risks. But as I was saying, we have governance, so we also look to manage these assets to ensure that it is resilient. And last point I would make is, being an Article 9, we also report on a number of KPI. We have 14 PAI on which we report every year. And this is also really key, because information is the basis of action. So with this information, then we are informed of how our asset is performing when it comes to sustainability, so resilience and adaptation. And then we can also take action on those this data that is reported to enhance the resilience and sustainability of those assets. So due diligence at entry, management through governance, and KPIs, which are key for action.
Thank you very much. Bérénice, from your point of view, during this question of our due diligence process, do you integrate the indicators representing adaptation and mitigation objectives?
Yeah, of course. Assessing, the climate resilience of our assets is a priority during due diligence, as it impacts both the long-term viability of our investment, but also their alignment with environmental goals. And I'm very glad to hear from Guillaume and Laurent that they are doing all those works about, mitigation, resilience. And I will just ask them, please share those data. We need it also as debt investor, because on your side, you are sitting at the board of this company, but on our side, we need those information in order to make an educated investment case vis-à-vis our investment committee. And it has, improved over time. So today we are able to receive sometimes ESG due diligence. We are not, at the beginning it was, looking at all the technical due diligence or insurance due diligence. We were trying to find information about floodings. Yes, we have seen that there has been an insurance payment because of a flood. So maybe potentially this asset is at risk, and we were able to raise questions to the sponsor. But today, what really we need as debt investor is to have access to this data, because it is also in our interest in order to put in place the required financing. And a second thought is, because we know that CapEx and mitigation CapEx will be needed for those assets, please do not stretch too much the financing on those assets, because that means that on your side as equity sponsor, when you will have to make all those investments, there will be not enough money ready for that.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Guillaume, do you want to add something on this question of resilience?
Yeah, I think Laurent and Bérénice covered a lot of good points already, but maybe just to go back to the point of Laurent, who should pay, I think clearly it's more challenging for adaptation than mitigation. Because the cash flows associated with adaptations are harder to identify. Instead, you're basically protecting against losses, which are uncertain and difficult to quantify. I think the other, important point is that for adaptation, for mitigation, there is a clear output, the CO2 emissions, which have a value as well. So you can actually, look at returns on that. It's not the case for adaptation. But maybe to finish on this from I think a more positive note as well for adaptation. I think one, it's more a problem for existing assets, I think, than new assets. I think for new assets, there's a lot of good frameworks in place, the design that are very resilient. So that's, I think, a positive. Second point is a lot can be done without major investments. It goes back to what I was saying a bit earlier today, in terms of asset-light initiatives. I think there's a lot that can be done already to increase resilience in general. And the last point is, I think, collaboration in general, because there's no competition between funds on adaptation. We can actually share best practice, not only funds, corporates, others. So I think a lot can be achieved through collaborations and sharing what we can do to make the assets more resilient.
Including data.
Definitely back to what Bérénice was saying around data. We can share data indeed. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Maybe a third question to end to finish our discussions. So now we have understood how the different players of this market are tackling the question of mitigation and more adaptation through this concept of resilience. Maybe we could ask now to our colleagues what is to be done on the question of labeling, for example. Is it necessary to be better on the labeling tools, to maybe to direct more investments on certain in certain directions, including adaptation efforts? For example, the Fast Infra label is including resilience as one of its 4 pillars. Do you think it's useful for you as a debt provider or equity investors? Maybe Bérénice, do you have a view on that?
Honest view. No. Labeling tools such as Fast Infra can indeed facilitate the financing of infrastructure. But what is very essential behind those labels is that they need to really add value. And they should not be just tick-the-box exercises. As I said earlier, what we need is to have qualified extra-financial data on those assets. So if thanks to a label, I'm able to have access to better extra-financial data, yes, label, why not? Yeah. But the difficulty behind label is that to be effective, they must be rigorous, they must be standardized, and they must be also consistently applied across market. To take one example, we had a label in France which is called Greenfin. It's a very good label, very useful, but beyond France, nobody knows this label. So really what would be useful is to have, thanks to a label, and the European taxonomy, it's not a label, but it has enabled us to discuss with the same language. And this is really what would be helpful, because everybody will say that its asset is resilience. Everybody will say that, yes, my asset is well prepared, but how to be sure that beyond words it will be effectively the case? And quoting also Antoine, it's complex. It's complex study. It's technical adaptability of infrastructure. It's beyond words. It's also a lot of tailor-made analysis. And if a label can, summarize all that with the same language for everybody, really welcome. But really what we need beyond label is to talk the same language.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Laurent, you want to elaborate on that question of no? Okay.
But I think Bérénice said it was the purpose of the taxonomy. And to come back on the adaptation and your initial question, I think we said it together, but it's in the DNA of infrastructure investors to build resilient assets. And from a lawyer perspective, I think we would have fascinating discussions and negotiations on the definitions of force majeure, on foreseeability, what exactly are the future climate conditions which will trigger these provisions in our contracts. I wanted also to maybe highlight in terms of adaptation one project which I think the public sector played a role very well. I'm the optimistic guy here. So we worked on the CGLOG project, which was launched by the Ministry of Armed Forces, and this is how the public sector has tendered a very bankable and investable project, which is at a very large scale able to launch the construction and renovation with adaptation, of course, in mind to climate change of thousands and thousands of housing units in France. I think this should be replicated further, and that's, I guess, the role of the public sector.
Thank you very much for this very interesting example. Maybe, Guillaume, you want to say a bit on that? No? On the financing tools to help transition, or indicators who could help investors to do more on adaptation?
I don't think I have too much to add to what has been said. I think it goes back a bit to last point of Bérénice around having more standards around resilience, commonly known standards around it will facilitate investment into that. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of challenges specifically for adaptation investment. So I think anything that can support that and channel more financing towards it is helpful.
Thank you very much. So I think it's time now to end this discussion. I want to thank our 4 brilliant panelists, and thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.